Such was unreasoning memory that, though he stood there openly and palpably a converted man, who was sorrowing for his past irregularities, a fear overcame her, paralyzing her movement so that she neither retreated nor advanced. To think of what emanated from that countenance when she saw it last, and to behold it now. There was the same handsome unpleasantness of mine, but now he wore neatly trimmed, old-fashioned whiskers, the sable moustache having disappeared, and his dress was half clerical, a modification which had changed his expression sufficiently to abstract the dandyism from his features and to hinder for a second her belief in his identity. To Tess's sense there was, just at first, a ghastly bizarrerie, a grim incongruity in the march of these solemn words of scripture out of such a mouth. This too familiar intonation, less than 4 years earlier, had brought to her ears expressions of such divergent purpose that her heart became quite sick at the irony of the contrast. Yet he was in earnest, unmistakably. It was less a reform than transfiguration. The former curves of sensuousness were now modulated to lines of devotional passion. The lip shapes that had meant seductiveness were now made to express supplication. The glow on the cheek that yesterday could be translated as righteousness was evangelized today into the splendor of pious enthusiasm. Animalism had become fanatism, paganism, Paulinism. The bold, rolling eye that had flashed upon her form in the old time with such mastery now beamed with the rude energy of a theology that was almost ferocious. Those black angularities which his face had used to put on when his wishes were thwarted now did duty in picturing the incorrigible backslider who would insist upon turning again to his wallowing in the mire. The lineaments as such seemed to complain. They had been diverted from their hereditary connotation to signify impressions for which nature did not intend them. Strange that their very elevation was a misapplication that Therese seemed to falsify. Yet could it be so? She would admit the ungenerous sentiment no longer. D'Urberville was not the first wicked man who had turned away from his wickedness to save his soul alive. And why should she deem it unnatural in him? It was but the usage of thought which had been jarred in her adhering good new words in bad old notes. The greater the sinner, the greater the saint. It was not necessary to dive far from Christian history to discover that. Such impressions as these moved her vaguely and without strict definiteness. As soon as the nerveless pause of her surprise would allow her to stir, her impulse was to pass on out of his sight. He had obviously not discerned her yet in her position against the sun. But the moment that she moved again, he recognized her. The effect upon her old lover was electric, far stronger than the effect of his presence upon her. His fire, the tumultuous ring of his eloquence, seemed to go out of him. His lips struggled and trembled under the words that lay upon it, but deliver them it could not, as long as she faced him. His eyes, after their first glance upon her face, hung determinedly in every other direction but hers, but came back in a desperate leap every few seconds. This paralysis lasted, however, but a short time, for stable, past the barn, and onward. As soon as she could reflect, it appalled her, this change in their relative platforms. He who had wrought her undoing was now on the side of the spirit, while she remained unregenerated. And, as in the legend, it had resulted that her Cripian image had suddenly appeared upon his altar, and the fire of the priest had been well nigh extinguished. She went on without turning her head. Her back seemed to be endowed with a sensitiveness to ocular beams, even her clothing, so alive that she fancied a gaze which might be resting upon her from the outside of that barn. All the way along to this point her heart had been heavy with an inactive sorrow. Now there was a change in the quality of its trouble. That hunger for affection, too long withheld, was for the time displaced by an almost physical sense of an implacable past which still engirdled her. It intensified her consciousness of error to a practical despair. The break of continuity between her earlier and present existence, which she had hoped for, had not, after all, taken place. Bygones would never be complete bygones till she was a bygone herself. Thus absorbed, she recrossed the northern half of Long Ash Lane at right angles, and presently saw before her the road ascending whitely to the upland, along whose margin the remainder of her journey lay. Its dry, pale surface stretched mercilessly onward, unbroken by a single figure, vehicle, or mark, save some occasional horse droppings which dotted its cold aridity here and there. While slowly breasting this ascent, Tess became conscious of footsteps behind her, and, turning quickly, she saw approaching that well-known form, so strangely accorded as the Methodist. The one personage in all the world she wished not to encounter alone on this side of the grave. There was not much time, however, for thought or illusion, and she yielded as calmly as she could to the necessity of letting him overtake her. She saw that he was excited, less by the speed of his walk than by the feelings within him. "Tess," he said. She slackened speed without looking round. "Tess," he repeated, "it is I, Alec d'Urberville." She then looked back at him, and he came up. "I see it is," she answered coldly. "Well, is that all? Yet I deserve no more. I heard you had gone away. Nobody knew where. Tess, you wonder why I have followed you?" "I do, rather, and I would that you had not, with all of my heart." "Yes, you may well say it," he returned gravely, as they moved onward together, she with unwilling tread. "But don't mistake me, and I beg this because you may have been led to do so in noticing, if you did notice it, how your sudden appearance unnerved me down there. It was but a momentary spasm, and, considering what you had been to me, it was natural enough. But God helped me through it, and immediately afterwards I felt that, of all persons in the world, whom it was my duty and desire to save from the wrath to come, the woman whom I had so grievously wronged was that person. I have come with that sole purpose in view, nothing more." There was the smallest vein of scorn in her words of rejoinder. "Have you saved yourself? Charity begins at home, they say." "I have done nothing," he said impetuously. "Heaven, as I have been telling my hearers, has done all. No amount of contempt that you can pour upon me, Tess, will equal what I have poured upon myself, the old Adam of my former years. But I can tell you the means by which my conversion interested enough in me to listen. Have you ever heard the name of the parson of a minister? You might have done so. Old Mr. Clare, one of the most earnest of his school, one of the few intense men left in the church. Not so intense as the extreme wing of Christian believers to which I belong, but quite an exception among the established clergy, the younger of whom are gradually attenuating the doctrines by their sophistries, till they are but the shadow of what they were. I only differ from him on the question of church and state, the interpretation of the text. Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. That's all. He is one who, I firmly believe, has been the humble means of saving more souls in this country than any other man you can name. Have you heard of him? I have, she said. He came to Tantridge 2 or 3 years ago to preach on behalf of some missionary society, and I, wretched man that I was, insulted him when, in his disinterestedness, he tried to reason with me and show me the way. He did not resent my conduct. He simply said that some day I should receive the first fruits of the Spirit, that those who came to scoff sometimes remained to pray. There was a strange magic in his words. They sank into my mind, though I did not know it at the time, nor did he, and by degrees I was brought to the light. Since then, my one desire has been to hand on the good news to others, and that is what I was trying to do today, though it is only lately that I have preached hereabout. The first months of my ministry have been spent in the north of England, among strangers, where I preferred to make my earliest clumsy attempts as to acquire courage before undergoing that severest of all tests of one's sincerity, addressing those who have known one and have been one's companions in the days of darkness. If you could only know, Tess, the sense of security, the certainty, you would, I am sure. Don't go on with it, she cried passionately, as she turned away from him to a stile by the wayside, on which she bent herself. I can't believe in such sudden things. I feel indignant with you for talking to me like this, when you know what harm you've done me. You, and those like you, take your fill of pleasure on earth by making the life of such as me bitter and black with sorrow, and then it is a fine thing, when you have had enough of that, to think of securing your pleasure in heaven by becoming converted. Out upon such, I don't believe in you. I hate it. Tess, he insisted, don't speak so. It came to me like a shining light. And you don't believe me. What don't you believe? Your conversion, your scheme of religion. Why? She dropped her voice. Because a better man than you does not believe in such. What a woman's reason. Who is this better man? I cannot tell you. Well, he declared, a resentment beneath his words seeming ready to spring out at a moment's notice. God forbid that I should say I am a good man, and you know I don't say any such thing. I am new to goodness, truly, but newcomers see farthest sometimes. Yes, she replied sadly, but I cannot believe in your conversion to new spirit. Such flashes as you feel, Alec, I fear don't last. Thus speaking, she turned from the stile over which she had been leaning, and faced him, whereupon his eyes, falling casually upon the familiar countenance and form, remained contemplating her. The inferior man was quiet in him now, but it was surely not extracted, nor even entirely subdued. Don't look It was to keep off the wind. It may seem harsh of me to dictate like this, he went on, but it is better that I should not look too often on you. It might be dangerous. Shh, said Tess. Well, women's faces have had too much power over me already for me not to fear them. An evangelist has nothing to do with such as they, and it reminds me of the old times that I would forget. After this, their conversation dwindled to a cursory remark now and then as they rambled onward, Tess inwardly wondering how far he was going with her, and not liking to send him back by positive mandate. Frequently, when they came to a gate or stile, they found painted thereon, in red letters, some text of scripture, and she asked him if he knew who had been at the pains to blazon these announcements. He told her that the man was employed by himself and others who were working with him in that district to paint these reminders, that no means might be left untried which might move the hearts of a wicked generation. At length the road touched the spot called Cross in Hand. Of all spots on this bleached and desolate upland, this was the most forlorn. It was so far removed from the charm which is sought in landscape by artists and view lovers as to reach a new kind of beauty, a negative beauty of tragic blackness. The place took its name from a stone pillar which stood there, a strange, rude monolith from a stratum unknown in any local quarry, on which was roughly carved a human hand. Differing accounts were given of its history and purport. Some authorities stated that a devotional cross had once formed the complete erection thereon, of which the present relic was but the stump. Others, that the stone as it stood was entire, and that it had been fixed there to mark a boundary or place of meeting. Anyhow, whatever the origin of the relic, there was, and is, something sinister or solemn, according to mood, in the scene amid which it stands, something tending to impress the most phlegmatic passer-by. I think I must leave you now, he remarked, as they drew near to this spot. I have to preach at Abbott's Sereno at 6 this evening, and my way lies across the right from here. And you upset me somewhat too, Tessie. I cannot, will not, say why. I must go away and get strength. How is it that you speak so fluently now? Who has taught you such good English? I have learned things in my troubles, she said, evasively. What troubles have you had? She told him of the first one, the only one that related to him. Heaven, said d'Urberville, I knew nothing of this till now. Why didn't you write to me? She did not reply, and he broke the silence by adding, Well, you will see me again. No, she answered, do not again come near me. I will think, but before we part, come here. He stepped up to the pillar. This was once a holy cross. Relics are not in my creed, but I fear you at moments, far more than you need fear me. And, to lessen my fear, put your hand upon that stone hand, and swear that you will never tempt me by your charms or ways. Good God, how can you ask what is so unnecessary? All that is furthest from my thought. Yes, but swear it, he pleaded desperately. Tess, half frightened, gave way to his importunity, placed her hand upon the stone, and swore. I am sorry you are not a believer, he continued, that some unbeliever should have got hold of you and unsettled your mind. But no more now. At home, at least, I can pray for you, and I will. And who knows what may not happen. I'm off. Goodbye. his eyes again rest upon her, leapt over, and struck out across the down in the direction of Abbott's Sereno. As he walked, his pace showed perturbation, and by, as if instigated by a bracing thought, he drew from his pocket a small Bible, between the leaves of which was folded a letter, worn and soiled as from much rereading. D'Urberville opened the letter. It was dated several months before this time, and was signed by Parson Clare. The letter began by expressing the writer's unfeigned joy at D'Urberville's conversion, and thanked him for his kindness in communicating with the parson on the subject. It expressed Mr. Clare's warm assurance of forgiveness for D'Urberville's former conduct, and his interest in the young man's plans for the future. He, Mr. Clare, would much have liked to see D'Urberville in the church, to whose ministry he had devoted so many years of his own life, and would have helped him to enter a theological college to that end. But since his correspondent had possibly not cared to do this on account of the delay it would have entailed, he was not the man to insist upon its paramount importance. Every man must work as he could best work, and in the method towards which he felt impelled by the Spirit. D'Urberville read and reread this letter, and seemed to fortify himself thereby. He also read some passages from his Bible as he walked, till his face assumed a calm, and apparently the image of Tess no longer troubled his mind. She, meanwhile, had kept along the edge of the hill, by which lay her nearest way home. Within the distance of a mile, she met a solitary shepherd. "What is the meaning of that old stone I have passed?" she asked of him. "Was it ever a holy cross?" "Cross? No, 'twere not a cross. 'Tis a thing of ill omen, miss. It was put up in old times by the relations of a malefactor who was tortured there by nailing his hand to a post, and afterwards hung. The bones lie underneath. They say he sold his soul to the devil, and that he walks at times." She felt the petite mort at this unexpectedly gruesome information, and left the solitary man behind her. It was dusk when she drew near to Flintcomb, and in the lane at the entrance to the hamlet she approached a girl and her lover without their observing her. They were talking no secrets, in the clear, unconcerned voice of the young woman, in response to the warmer accents of the man, spread into the chilly air as the one soothing thing within the dusky horizon, full of a stagnant obscurity upon which nothing else intruded. For a moment the voices cheered the heart of Tess, till she reasoned that this interview had its origin, on one side or the other, in the same attraction which had been the prelude to her own tribulation. When she came close, the girl turned serenely and recognized her, the young man walking off in embarrassment. The woman was Hewitt, whose interest in Tess's excursion immediately superseded her own proceedings. Tess did not explain very clearly its results, and who was a girl of tact, began to speak of her own little affair, a phase of which Tess had just witnessed. "He is Amby Seedling, the chap who used to sometimes come and help at Talbothy's," she explained indifferently. "He actually inquired and found out that I had come here, and has followed me. He says he's been in love with me these 2 years, but I've hardly answered him." Chapter 46. Several days had passed since her futile journey, and Tess was afield. The dry winter wind still blew, but a screen of thatched hurdles, erected in the eye of the blast, kept its force away from her. On the sheltered side was a turnip-slicing machine, whose bright blue hue of new paint seemed almost vocal in the otherwise subdued scene. Opposite its front miles up the incline towards the Swede gutters. From the proportions of a mere point, it advanced to the shape of a ninepin, and was soon perceived to be a man in black, arriving from the direction of Flintcamash. The man at the slicer, having nothing else to do with his eyes, continually observed the comer, but Tess, who was occupied, did not perceive him till her companion directed her attention to his approach. It was not her hard taskmaster, Farmer Groby. It was one in a semi-clerical costume, who now represented what had once been the daredevil, Alec d'Urberville. Not being hot at his preaching, there was less enthusiasm about him now, and the presence of the grinder seemed to embarrass him. A pale distress was already on Tess's face, and she pulled her curtained hood further over it. D'Urberville came up and said quietly, "I want to speak to you, Tess. You have refused my last request not to come near me," said she. "Yes, but I have a good reason." "Well, tell it." "It is more serious than you may think." He glanced round to see if he were overheard. They were at some distance from the man who turned the slicer, and the movement of the machine, too, sufficiently prevented Alec's words reaching other ears. D'Urberville placed himself so as to screen Tess from the labourer, turning his back to the latter. "It is this," he continued, with impetuous compunction. "In thinking of your soul and mine when we last met, I neglected to inquire as to your worldly condition. You were well dressed, and I did not think of it, but I see now that it is harder than it used to be when I knew you, harder than you deserve. Perhaps a good deal of it is owing to me." She did not answer, and he watched her inquiringly as, with bent head, her face completely screened by the hood, she resumed her trimming of the Swedes. By going on with her work, she felt better able to keep him outside her emotions. "Tess," he added, with a sigh that verged on a groan, "yours was the very worst case I ever was concerned in. I had no idea of what had resulted till you told me. Wretch that I was to foul that innocent life. The whole blame was mine, the whole blackness of the sin, the awful, awful iniquity. You, too, the real blood of which I am but the base imitation. What a blind young thing you were as to possibilities. I say in all earnestness that it is a shame for parents to bring up their girls in such dangerous ignorance of the gins and nets that the wicked may set for them, whether their motive be a good one or the result of simple indifference." Tess still did no more than listen, throwing down one globular root and taking up another with automatic regularity, the pensive contour of the mere fieldwoman alone marking her. "It is not that I came to say," D'Urberville went on. "My circumstances are these. I have lost my mother since you were at Tantridge, and the place is my own, but I intend to sell it and devote myself to missionary work in Africa, either as an ordained deacon or as an outside worker. I care very little which. Now, what I want to ask you is, will you put it in my power to do my duty, to make the only reparation I can make for the wrong I did you? That is, will you be my wife and go with me? I have already obtained this to save time." He threw a piece of parchment from his pocket. "What is it?" said she. "A marriage license." "Oh no, sir, no," she said that? And as he asked the question, a disappointment, which was not entirely the disappointment of thwarted duty, crossed d'Urberville's face. It was unmistakably a symptom that something of his old passion for her had been revived. Duty and desire ran hand in hand. Surely, he began again, in more impassioned tones, and then looked round at the labourer who turned the slicer. Tess, too, felt that the argument could not be ended there. Informing the man that a gentleman had come to see her, with whom she wished to walk a little way, she moved off with d'Urberville across the zebra-striped field. When they reached the first newly ploughed section, he held out his hand to help her over it. But she stepped forward on the summits of the earth rolls as if she did not see him. You will not marry me, Tess, and make me a self-respecting man, he repeated as soon as they were over the furrows. I cannot. But why? You know I have no affection for you. But you would get to feel that in time, perhaps, as soon as you really could forgive me. Never. Why so positive? I love somebody else. The words seemed to stupefy him. You do, he cried. Somebody else. But has not a sense of what is morally right and proper any weight with you. No, no, no. Don't say that. Anyhow, then, your love for this other man may be only a passing feeling, which you will overcome. No, no. Yes, yes. Why not? I cannot tell you. You must, in honour. Well then, I have married him. Ah, he exclaimed, and he stopped dead and gazed at her. I did not wish to tell. I did not mean to, she pleaded. It is a secret here, or at any rate, but dimly known. So will you, please, will you keep from questioning me? You must remember that we are now strangers. Strangers. Are we? Strangers. For a moment, a flash of his old irony marked his face, but he determinedly chastened it down. Is that man your husband? He asked mechanically, denoting by a sign the labourer who turned the machine. That man, she said proudly. I should think not. Who, then? Do not ask what I do not wish to tell, she begged, and, in her eagerness, flashed an appeal to him from her upturned face and lash-shadowed eyes. D'Urberville was disturbed. But I only asked for your sake, he retorted hotly. Thunder of heaven! God forgive me for such an expression. I came here, I swear, as I thought for your good, Tess. Don't look at me so. I cannot stand your looks. There never were such eyes, surely, before Christianity or since. There, I won't lose my head. I dare not. I own that the sight of you has revived my love for you, which, I believed, was extinguished with all such feelings. But I thought that our marriage might be a sanctification for us both. The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, I said to myself. But my plan is dashed from me, and I must bear the disappointment. He moodily reflected with his eyes on the ground. Married. Married. Well, that being so, he added, quite calmly, tearing the license slowly into halves and putting them in his pocket. That being prevented, I should like to do some good to you and your husband, whoever he may be. There are many questions that I am tempted to ask, but I will not do so, of course, in opposition to your wishes. Though, if I could know your husband, I might more easily benefit him and you. Is he on this farm? No, she murmured. He is far away. Far away from you. What sort of husband can he be? Oh, do not speak against him. It was through you he found out. Ah, it is so. That's sad, Tess. Yes, but to stay away from you, to leave you to work like this. He does not leave me to work, she cried, springing to the defence of the absent one with all her fervour. He don't know it. It is by my own arrangement. Then does he write? I cannot tell you. There are things which are private to ourselves. Of course, that means he does not. You are a deserted wife, my poor Tess. In an impulse, he turned suddenly to take her hand. The buff glove was on it, and he seized only the rough leather fingers, which did not express the shape, the life or shape of those within. You must not, she cried fearfully, slipping her hand from the glove as from a pocket, and leaving it in his grasp. Oh, will you go away, for the sake of me, my husband? Go in the name of your own Christianity. Yes, I will, he said hastily, and, thrusting the glove back to her, turned to leave. Facing round, however, he said, Tess, as God is my judge, I meant no sin in taking your hand. A pattering of hoofs on the soil of the field, which they had not noticed in their preoccupation, ceased close behind them, and a voice reached her ear. What the devil are you doing away from your work at this time of day? Farmer Groby had espied the two figures from the distance, and had inquisitively ridden across to learn what was their business in this field. Don't speak like that to her, said d'Urberville, his face blackening with something that was not Christianity. Indeed, mister, and what mid-Methodist parsons have to do with she? Who is the fellow? Asked d'Urberville, turning to Tess. She went close up to him. Go, I do beg you, she said. What? And leave you to that tyrant? I can see in his face what a girl he is. He won't hurt me. He's not in love with me. I can leave at Lady Day. Well, I have no right but to obey, I suppose. But, well, goodbye. Her defender, whom she dreaded more than her assailant, having reluctantly disappeared, the farmer continued his reprimand, which Tess took with the greatest coolness, that sort of attack being independent of sex. To have as a master this man of stone, who would have cuffed her if he had dared, was almost a relief after her former experiences. She silently walked back towards the summit of the field that was the scene of her labour, so absorbed in the interview which had just taken place that she was hardly aware that the nose of Groby's horse almost touched her shoulders. If so be you make an agreement to work for me till Lady Day, I'll see that you carry it out, he growled. Odd woman, now 'tis one thing, and then 'tis another, but I'll put up with it no longer. Knowing very well that he did not harass the other women of the farm as he harassed her out of spite for the flooring he had once received, she did for one moment picture what might have been the result if she had been free to accept the offer just made her of being the moneyed Alec's wife. It would have lifted her completely out of subjection, not only to her present oppressive employer, but to a whole world who seemed to despise her. But no, she said breathlessly. I could not have married him now. He is so unpleasant to me. That very night she began an appealing letter to Claire, concealing from him her hardships effusions. He had asked Is to go with him, and perhaps did not care for her at all. She put the letter in her box and wondered if it would ever reach Angel's hands. After this, her daily tasks were gone through heavily enough, and brought on the day which was of great import to agriculturalists, the day of the Candlemas Fair. It was at this fair that new engagements were entered into for the 12 months following the ensuing Lady Day, and those of the farming population who thought of changing their places jolly attended to the country at the county town where the fair was held. Nearly all the labourers on Flintcomash farm intended flight, and early in the morning there was a general exodus in the direction of the town, which lay at a distance of from 10 to a dozen miles over hilly country. Though Tess also meant to leave at the quarter day, she was one of the few who did not go to the fair, having a vaguely shaped hope that something would happen to render another outdoor engagement unnecessary. It was a peaceful February day of wonderful softness for the time, and one would almost have thought that winter was over. She had hardly finished her dinner when d'Urberville's figure darkened the window of the cottage wherein she was a lodger, which she had all to herself today. Tess jumped up, but her visitor had knocked at the door, and she could hardly, in reason, run away. D'Urberville's knock, his walk up to the door, had some indescribable quality of difference from his air when she last saw him. They seemed to be acts of which the doer was ashamed. She thought that she would not open the door, but as there was no sense in that either, she arose, and, having lifted the latch, stepped back quietly. He came in, saw her, and flung himself down into a chair before speaking. Tess, I couldn't help it, he began desperately, as he wiped his heated face, which had also a superimposed flush of excitement. I felt that I must call to at least ask how you are. I assure you, I had not been thinking of you at all till I saw you that Sunday. Now I cannot get rid of your image, try how I may. It is hard that a good woman should do harm to a bad man. Yes, so it is. If you would only pray for me, Tess. The suppressed distraction of his manner was almost pitiable, and yet Tess did not pity him. How can I pray for you, she said, when I am forbidden to believe that the great power who moves the world would alter his plans on my account? You really think that? Yes, I have been cured of the presumption of thinking otherwise. Cured? By whom? By my husband, if I must tell. Ah, your husband. How strange it seems. I remember you hinted something of the sort the other day. What do you really believe in these matters, Tess? He asked. You seem to have no religion, perhaps owing to me. But I have, though I don't believe in anything supernatural. D'Urberville looked at her with misgiving. Then, do you think that the line I take is all wrong? A good deal of it. And yet, I felt so sure about it, he said uneasily. I believe in the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount, and so did my dear husband. But I don't believe. Here she gave her negations. The fact is, said D'Urberville dryly, whatever your dear husband believed, you accept, and whatever he rejected, you reject, without the least inquiry or reasoning on your own part. That's just like you women. Your mind is enslaved to his. Ah, because he knew everything, said she, with a triumphant simplicity of faith in Angel Clare, that the most perfect man could hardly have deserved much much less her husband. Yes, but you should not take negative opinions wholesale from another person like that. A pretty fellow he must be to teach you such skepticism. He never forced my judgment. He would never argue on the subject with me. But I looked at it in this way. What he believed, after inquiring deeply into doctrines, which was much more likely to be right than what I might believe, who hadn't looked into doctrines at all. What used he to say? He must have said something. She reflected, and with her acute memory for the letter of Angel Clare's remarks, even when she did not comprehend their spirit, she recalled a merciless, polemical syllogism that she had heard him use when, as it occasionally happened, he indulged in a species of thinking aloud with her at his side. In delivering it, she gave also Clare's accent and manner with reverential faithfulness. "Say that again," asked d'Urberville, who had listened with the greatest attention. She repeated the argument, and d'Urberville thoughtfully murmured the words after her. "Anything else?" he presently asked. He said at another time something like this, and she gave another, which might possibly have been paralleled in many a work of the pedigree ranging from the Dictionnaire Philosophique to Huxley's Essays. How do you remember them? I wanted to believe what he believed, though he didn't wish me to, and I managed to coax him to tell me of a few of his thoughts. I can't say I quite understand that one, but I know it is right. Fancy your being able to teach me what you don't know yourself." He fell into thought. "And so I threw in my spiritual lot with his," she resumed. "I didn't wish it to be different. What's good enough for him is good enough for me." "Does he know that you are as big a skeptic as he?" "No, I never told him, if I am a skeptic." "Well, you are better off today than I am, Tess, after all. You don't believe that you ought to preach my doctrine, and therefore do no despite to your conscience in abstaining. I do believe I ought to preach it, but, like the devils, I believe and tremble, for I suddenly leave off preaching it, and give way to my passion for you." "How?" "Why," he said wearily, "I have come all the way here to see you today, but I started from home to go to Casterbridge Fair, where I have undertaken to preach the word from a wagon at 2:30 this afternoon, and where all the brethren are expecting me this minute. Here's the announcement." He drew from his breast pocket a poster whereon was printed the day, hour, and place of meeting, at which he, d'Urberville, would preach the gospel, as aforesaid. "But how can you get there?" said Tess, looking at the clock. "I cannot get there. I have come here." "But you have really arranged to preach "I have arranged to preach, and I shall not be there, by reason of my burning desire to see a woman whom I once despised. No, by my word and truth, I never despised you. If I had, I should not love you now. Why I did not despise you was on account of your intrinsic purity, in spite of all. You withdrew yourself from me so quickly and resolutely when you saw the situation. You did not remain at my pleasure. So there was one victim in the world for whom I had no contempt, and you are she. But you may well despise me now. I thought I worshipped on the mountains, but I find I still serve in the groves. Oh, Alec d'Urberville, what does this mean? What have I done? Done, he said, with a soulless sneer at himself. Nothing intentionally, but you have been the means, the innocent means, of my backsliding, as they call it. I ask myself, Am I, indeed, one of those servants of corruption who, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, are again entangled therein and overcome, whose latter end is worse than their beginning? He laid his hand on her shoulder. Tess, Tess, I was on the way to salvation till I saw you again, he said, feverishly shaking her as if she were a child. And why then have you tempted me? I was firm as a man could be till I saw those eyes and that mouth again. Surely there never was such a maddening mouth since Eve's. His voice sank, and a hot archness shot from his own black eyes. You temptress Tess, you dear witch of Babylon, I could not resist you as soon as I met you again. I couldn't help your seeing me again, said Tess, recoiling. I know it. I repeat that I do not blame you, but the fact remains. When I saw you ill-used on the farm that day, I was nearly mad to think that I had no legal right to protect you, that he could not have it, whilst he who has it seems to neglect you utterly. Don't speak against him. He is absent, she cried excitedly. Treat him honourably. He has never wronged you. Oh, leave his wife before any scandal spreads that may do grievous harm to his honest name. I will, he said, like a man awakening from a lurid dream. I've broken my engagement to preach Christ to those poor drunken sinners at the fair. It is the first time I have done such a monstrous thing. A month ago I should have been horrified at such a possibility. I'll go away to hide, and can I pray? Then suddenly, one clap, Tessie, one, only for old friendship. I am defenceless, Alec. A good man's honour is in my keeping. Think, and be ashamed. Oh yes, my God. He clenched his lips, mortified with himself for his weakness. His eyes were equally barren of amatory and religious hope. The corpses of those old black passions which had lain inanimate amid the lines of his face ever since his reformation seemed to wake and come together as in a resurrection. He went out indeterminately, hardly responsible for his acts. Though d'Urberville had declared that this breach of his engagement today was the simple backsliding of a believer, Tess's words, as echoed from Angel Clare, had made a deep impression upon him, and continued to do so after he had left her. He moved on in silence, as if his energies were benumbed by the hitherto undreamt of possibility that his position was untenable. Reason had had nothing to do with his conversion, and the drops of logic that Tess had let fall into the sea of his enthusiasm served to chill its effervescence to stagnation. He said to himself, as he pondered again and again over the crystallized phrases that she had handed to him, unto him, that clever fellow little thought that, by telling her those things, he might be paving my way